A journalist and activist in Belarus has been sentenced to 8 years in prison for plotting unrest and planning to seize power. Roman Protasiewicz was arrested in May 2021 when his Ryanair flight to Lithuania was forced by authorities to land in the Belarusian capital, Minsk. He ran a Telegram news channel that was widely used by protesters opposing the election of 2020 that saw Alexander Lukashenko claim a sixth term in office. And I'm joined by our Riga bureau chief, Yuri Resheto. Yuri, who exactly is Roman Protasiewicz and what is he accused of?
Well, Roman Protasiewicz is almost 28 years old, and for the last 2 years he has been under investigation. 11 criminal cases were brought against him, including organizing mass protests, inciting social discord, creating of an extremist organization, and conspiracy to seize power. Protasiewicz, you mentioned it, he was the chief editor of the Telegram channel Nechta in 2020, so 3 years ago. Nechta was the Belarusian opposition's main media during the protests after the presidential elections, and that channel was later labeled extremist by the Belarusian authorities. In May 2021, Protasiewicz was on a Ryanair plane from Greece to Lithuania. While flying over Belarus, the plane surprisingly landed in Minsk, allegedly because there was a bomb on board. And after the landing, Protasiewicz was immediately arrested, and according to him, he faced the death penalty. But just a month after his arrest, a big interview with him was published where he confessed his guilt, surprisingly.
Tell us more about that confession and why that didn't help.
Well, nobody knows under what circumstances he confessed, but one can imagine that Protasiewicz didn't do it voluntarily. The interview was a kind of show trial because it was broadcast on state TV, and of course it was meant to scare off others. And one could clearly see that the journalist wasn't physically in the best shape. Back then, perhaps he was tortured. The fact that he confessed his supposed guilt was understandable to many under those circumstances. What was resented was that Protasiewicz supplied the names of his colleagues and other opposition figures to the police, but apparently that didn't help much either. Today he has been sentenced, you mentioned it, to 8 years in prison.
What does this verdict mean for other Belarusian journalists and for freedom of the press in Belarus?
Well, publicly, Protasiewicz denies that the Belarusian authorities put pressure on him. He states that he regrets what he did in 2020. And of course, this real or faked confession, we don't know, is a big blow for all independent journalists in Belarus. But the case of Protasiewicz isn't a single case, Ben. And it's not just about journalists. Human rights activist and Nobel Prize winner Ales Bialatsky was sentenced recently to 10 years in prison. Other opposition politicians and journalists were put behind bars for many years. A lot of journalists, human rights defenders from Belarus left the country. Most of them are now in neighboring Lithuania, but there are also Belarusian colleagues here in Riga, in Latvia, who are still covering events in the country from abroad.
Thank you for the analysis. Yuri Resheto in Riga. Well, press freedom has also taken a massive blow in Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. New laws there forbid journalists from criticizing the Kremlin's so-called special military operation, and there are very few independent media outlets left in Russia. As we mark the 30th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day, we take a look at one of those outlets, Taiga Info, which operates out of Serbia.
In the name of the law, stop this action immediately. The police warning is unequivocal. The scene, an anti-war demonstration in Novosibirsk a year ago. These pictures were taken by reporters from the local internet portal Taiga.info, one of the few independent media outlets still working in Russia. But since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, their work has changed. We used to report on life in Siberia for the whole of Russia. Now it's the other way around. We report on life in Russia for Siberia, because everything that is currently happening in our country is reported by the national media from a different angle. That angle is unconditional support of the Kremlin's policies, especially the war in Ukraine. Critics are silenced with draconian punishments, made possible by a law criminalizing anything the Kremlin sees as discrediting the armed forces. That means that virtually any critical statement about the actions of the Russian army can lead to a fine or imprisonment, which is why most independent media have had to leave Russia or close down altogether. Taiga.info decided to stay and continue the web portal's now 18-year history, but it hasn't been easy. We are forced to constantly maneuver and not cross the red lines. The circle of people who continue to talk to us has become smaller. Smaller because even those who have always sympathized with us are now forced to keep their distance. It has become much harder to get information. In order to protect colleagues from possible prosecution, Taiga.info decided not to report directly on the war, but on its consequences for people, on economic problems, social problems, and of course on mobilization. The creators constantly face opposition from the authorities. Recently, they were met with a hostile reaction from state television when Taiga.info exposed a deputy who signed up as a volunteer for the front but disappeared on his way to Ukraine. A traitor in the ranks. That's a headache for the authorities. Of course we are all afraid. But either you are trapped in this fear, or you can overcome it and make change happen. Of course, this change can only be achieved with small steps. But we shouldn't just stay silent. Although the media regulator blocked Taiga.info a year ago, the website reaches its audience through VPN encryption, and they want to continue reporting on Russia in Russia.